We are so willing to give up ourselves for our relationships, for our children, for our partners, for our families, that we forget to take care of ourselves.
Welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Kate Bryan, and I'm really excited to be back here for another week with our final episode of our Incarceration in Women series. This is not the end, but rather it's just the beginning. We have 10 episodes, all different stories and perspectives and women who are changing the world through their lives. If you missed any of these episodes, I encourage you to go back and listen to them. And this, again, is not the end. We have so much more to come. We're going to be talking about incarceration and women probably for the rest of One Girl Revolution's life. So this is just the beginning. When it comes to women and incarceration, there is so much to unpack and to discuss. But this series, and particularly this episode, will open your eyes and help you to see your incarcerated sisters in a different light. Before we get into this week's episode, please subscribe to the One Girl Revolution podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. Subscribe to us on YouTube at One Girl Revolution, and check out our website, onegirlrevolution.com, for more podcast episodes, videos, and so much more. Also, don't forget to check out our short documentary, The Girl Inside, on YouTube, and you can find the link on our website. On this week's episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Emily Salisbury. She's a professor at University of Utah. She's the director of the Utah Criminal Justice Center, and she's the co-creator of the Women's Risk Needs Assessment. Dr. Salisbury joins the One Girl Revolution podcast to share her own life story, her journey into academia, and how she ended up becoming focused on incarceration and women. Dr. Salisbury is one of the leading experts on women and incarceration, so she was the most perfect person to end this 10-episode series with. In this episode, Dr. Salisbury discusses the differences that set women and girls apart when it comes to incarceration. She discusses the unique struggles and experiences that women and girls face. She talks about her incredible TED Talk, which I will link in the show notes. She shares stories from her world-changing work and so much more. We also discuss the Women's Risk Needs Assessment, WRNA, the WRNA system, a system that Dr. Salisbury co-created, which is the only validated, peer-reviewed risk need strength assessment specifically designed from the ground up by and for justice-involved women to keep women out of incarcerated settings. Dr. Salisbury is a force to be reckoned with, and she is revolutionizing the way that the world looks at women and incarceration, how jails and prisons are treating and working with women, and she is changing the world every single day through her work. I am so honored and excited to share this episode with you. I know it's going to blow you away. So without further ado, here's Dr. Emily Salisbury. Emily, welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks so much.
I am so honored and excited to have you on. And I know I shared with you before, but just so our listeners know, I had been talking to our mutual friend, Kim Bogucki. And when I was talking to her about this series, this very important series on women in incarceration, she was like, you have to talk to Emily. Emily is one of the leading experts on this issue. And so thank you for your time and thank you for being on the podcast. But before we get into your work and all the great things that you're doing, I'd love to start off by asking you, who is a One Girl Revolution in your life? Who is a woman or girl that's inspired you?
Gosh, there's so many. Kate, I have done this work for so long, it's hard to pick just one, but I think in thinking back and some of the work that I've done, I have to name this incredibly inspiring woman, Vera Moore, who I was working with and still continue to work with down in Las Vegas. She's formerly incarcerated, African-American woman, and has decided to really revolutionize the housing sort of area in Las Vegas to make sure that women who are releasing from incarcerated settings have access to housing. It's one of the things that continuously comes up in nearly every jurisdiction for formerly incarcerated women, that there's just not enough housing, and safe housing, not just any kind of housing, but safe housing. And so she has begun to really push for this issue in Las Vegas. And if you think about the kind of context of Las Vegas and what it looks like, a very hypersexualized community. It it just becomes even more important in terms of helping women recognize that they are more than their bodies. They're more than, a lot more than what they may think they are. So yeah, I'm gonna go with Vera because she's been very inspiring to me in a lot of different ways.
That work is so important that she's doing too. We've had a couple of formerly incarcerated women in this series, and just the things that they share are things that the majority of people, unless you're working on the issue of incarceration or you know somebody who's been incarcerated, you don't really think about all the different things that people deal with when they get out, and especially women, being reunified with their kids, trying to get a job or housing, all the different facets, and it's just like thrown at them all at once, and there need to be more resources. So that's just incredible what Vera's doing. So I want to talk about all your research and the great work that you're doing. But before we do that, I would love to just rewind, because I'm always curious about people's stories and what lead them to where they are and what makes them want to be involved in the different things that they're involved in and doing the work that they're doing. So I would love to rewind and talk about your early life, just a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and maybe your family.
Yeah. So, I personally am not a formally incarcerated person. I'm not somebody who's justice involved. And I think that's important to recognize, just because we need more people who are justice involved, really speaking to these issues and at the table for changing policies. But so I grew up in Oklahoma, in the Midwest, sort of Midwest culture, middle class culture. Quite frankly, had a lot of privilege growing up, didn't have a ton of adversity growing up, and was, sort of able to really educate myself on a lot of different issues, and had access to a lot of opportunities that I know a lot of folks don't have access to. And for a long time, I, sort of wasn't sure what I wanted to do, like many young people, and had incredible mentorship during my, sort of academic career. And that's really steered me towards, what I love to do now, and especially around, of course, working with and on behalf of justice-involved women. But my family was pretty tight-knit family, pretty healthy. I haven't experienced a ton of adversity, which again, I feel like we have to sort of identify sometimes that, I'm not somebody who's experienced a ton of trauma, and that is actually a privilege. That's another privilege I think that we have to recognize and acknowledge. But I grew up playing tennis, playing soccer, was state champion and of my high school tennis team. Those were the glory days. And I think, team sports, especially as a young woman, really helped me find my voice. I was a very introspective, kind of introverted kid, which a lot of people today don't believe when I tell them that. It took me a long time to sort of find my voice. And that's under a context of having lots of privilege. And so if you think about helping women find their voice, particularly economically marginalized, women of color, right? That's why we have to empower them even more. So one of the reasons.
That's really powerful too, even thinking about if you were very kind of quieter and introspective, you know what it feels like not to have a voice. I'm sure there are points in your life, in your young life, that you could point to, like you didn't feel listened to. And I know myself, even though I feel like I had a great family and had a great community around me, which so many people are not fortunate enough to have. And I'm really grateful for that. But I can relate to the incarcerated or formerly incarcerated community, because I know what it feels like to often be forgotten, just because I can point back to some of those things in my early life, not to take away from them, but I think that empathy is so important in the world.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
So what was it that made you get into academia? You're going from that. I'm curious what made you get into academia. And then, of course, what led you to get involved in the justice system or doing research on incarceration?
So, I just was a good student, quite frankly. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to pursue graduate education during my undergraduate years. So my master's is in forensic psychology, and I thought it was a really cool field, to be honest. I'm like, that sounds fascinating. And, at first I wanted to be a jury consultant and help sort of, attorneys pick out juries and the whole voir dire process. But I, had, again, really good mentorship during my master's program where, I was taking a class on correctional psychology. And, you might ask, what the heck is that? Well, it's basically the science behind helping individuals who are justice involved and the staff who work with them implement the science behind what we know to be necessary for effective behavioral change. And that class just kind of blew my mind, and it was taught by somebody who was very skilled as well, and sort of took me under his wing academically, and went on to pursue my PhD in criminology and criminal justice. And again, even there, I wasn't quite sure what, I knew, getting a PhD probably meant academia, but I had to really learn again to the point again about, learning how to teach somebody who's, introverted. It's not easy to get up in front of people initially and start teaching. And for a while there, I sort of felt like I was a week ahead of the students, when you first start out. But I remember something that my mom told me years ago, many, many years ago, that, if you have knowledge that other people don't have, you sort of have an obligation to share it. And you're oftentimes going to have to share it, orally, not just on social media, not just in written form, but, in front of people. And, that sort of prompted me to think differently about, my teaching career. And of course, I love to teach now. But, getting into this space of criminal justice and criminology, I just was consumed with wanting to learn as much as I possibly could about our system. And again, had incredible mentorship at my doctoral studies. Dr. Pat Van Boris was my mentor, and she very much cared about the issues of incarcerated women and justice-involved women. And I didn't realize how much I cared about it until I started to learn more about it and really do deep dives into, those kinds of intellectual inquiries and thinking about how, women walk through this world in a very different kind of way than men do.
Yeah, that really struck a chord with me, because and I know you and I spoke about this when I had the opportunity to go into Cook County Jail. I had never set foot in a jail or prison before. I had driven past them. I knew people that had formerly been incarcerated, but didn't know that many details about it. And then it's been the more that I've learned and the more that I know, and particularly when it comes to women in incarceration, I want to know more, and I want to find more ways to talk about it. And we obviously need to be talking about it because women are the fastest growing population in jail and prison. And I don't feel like we even hear about that in the news or see headlines about that. It's just this forgotten about population, and women are just pushed by the wayside. And so we need to find ways to elevate them and talk about this. And so for you, I know that you're a professor, but also I want to talk about your very powerful TED Talk, which I will be sure to post in the show notes so people can watch it. And I was really struck by a lot of different things that you mentioned in it, and I would love for you to share a little bit about it. But you started your talk by quoting Dostoevsky, and you said, the degree of civilization in a society, or his quote says, the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. And when you read that quote, it just hit me so hard. Why did you start your TED Talk with that quote? And what does that mean to you in all of your research?
Yeah, I think thank you for that. I appreciate it. I think people need to recognize what's going on behind the wall, and that it truly is a reflection of our society based on what we do with people who, some might say are the lowest of the low. Of course, I don't feel that way, but the people that are oftentimes forgotten, the children, that recognizing that they were once children in our society as well. And so I started off the TED Talk with that to really help people remember too that, I actually think we should judge societies by walking into women's prisons. Because they are even more economically and socially marginalized in comparison to men. And then of course, women of color, poor women of color, like even more economically and socially marginal. And so if we really want to know, we really want to judge our society by, what we do with incarcerated populations, I think stakeholders should walk into women's prisons and see what we do there.
Yeah, and talking to incarcerated or formerly incarcerated women, I know through my own experiences, and I know you have so many others, you probably could write books and books and books about different women that you've come in contact with and stories you've heard, but even hearing stories about in women's prisons, how they don't even have windows. So women are locked away in certain ones. I'm not saying all of them are this way, but I've talked to so many women that they were like, yeah, I hadn't even seen the sunshine in months or years. Or they don't have an outdoor area where the men have a basketball court and then they have this and they have that. And of course, a lot of the jails and prisons, they may have more men, so they have more available for them. But women, there are less of them, but they end up getting the short end of the stick. And I know those are just a couple of examples, but you see that so often in everything that you're researching.
Absolutely. And the fact that women are, just generally speaking, more relational in nature. And what I mean by that is our identities and sort of senses of self-worth are oftentimes wrapped up in the kinds and qualities of relationships that we have with other people. It's particularly harmful for incarcerated women, the disruption in the relationships with the outside individuals that they have relationships with, families, children, and sort of, partners. But it's especially painful for them because we're socialized to be nurturing, we're socialized to be relational in nature. And so that's why you see these things like, pseudo families kind of creep up, right, in institutions as a way of coping for the loss of relationships that many women have had as a result of incarceration. And I mean, there's countless examples of how incarcerated women are ignored, dismissed, an afterthought in correctional systems. And yeah, in part, it's because they make up, right, only about 7% of any incarcerated population. But the ripple effect, of course, of their incarceration, many argue, has far more social impact because they are primary caregivers of children and typically taking care of their families upon release. And so, yeah, there's a number of different things that we can kind of think about in terms of, and so, that's the work that I do, is I oftentimes help wardens and superintendents who do care to try to not be, the dismissed institution, because oftentimes there's just one institution in most states, to sort of get creative on how they can use their budget to their advantage to help women in their system and in their facilities get better resources. But oftentimes they're coming up against leadership that simply don't understand how a budget can affect a facility that incarcerates women very differently. Even it gets down to even basic things like access, right, to feminine hygiene products. The fact that most prisons don't just make those freely available to women, and that women oftentimes have to negotiate and barter and get access to feminine hygiene products because staff think it's a security issue. Well, we've seen in institutions where they let that happen, where they allow it to be freely accessible, that women don't abuse that so-called privilege.
If you're enjoying this episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, you can see more about the lives, struggles, hopes, and dreams of incarcerated women in One Girl Revolution's The Girl Inside on YouTube. The Girl Inside is a short documentary. It's only 10 minutes, so not a huge commitment, that features the stories and voices of 5 incarcerated women at Cook County Jail and an academic storytelling class that changed their lives. The link is in the show notes. Please watch and share The Girl Inside today. And now back to the show. One of the highlights of your career was that you co-created the Women's Risk Needs Assessment System. I would love to hear more about that. I know I've read a little bit, you and I've talked about it. Can you share with our listeners what that is, why you created it, and what else can you tell me about it?
Yeah, so we refer to it as the WRNA, and it's really the only peer-reviewed, validated risk, need, and strength assessment system specifically designed by and for justice-involved women. And so when we talk about risk assessment, what we mean is there are a lot of decisions that are made on behalf of incarcerated people based off of an assessment that is intended to predict in institutions serious misconducts and in the community future recidivism or ongoing sort of criminal or antisocial behavior. And it's not perfect prediction, risk assessment, but it's far better than simply our gut level feelings about how people might behave. And so that science behind risk assessment becomes really important to get right on the front end of somebody's sentence. And most of those assessment tools are developed and designed for male populations and then applied to women as if women's pathways to crime are exactly the same as men's, as if their risk factors are exactly the same, as if their needs and strengths are exactly the same. And there's enough literature out there, the jury is out, that women are walk again through this world in a very different way and have very different needs. And some things look similar on paper, like substance abuse or substance use, but in actuality, there's a wealth of literature and research out there that shows and demonstrates that even the onset to addiction looks different oftentimes for women than it does for men. They're oftentimes introduced to substances by people who they are in relationship with. They're not oftentimes taking drugs and using substances for the thrill of it, though that certainly does happen. And then the sort of after effect and recovery looks different for justice-involved women as well. So even things that look like it's similar, when you pick apart the behavior, the kinds of crimes that they commit, just really start to look different. It takes more provocation for women to become violent. On the whole, generally, women aren't as violent, which certainly doesn't mean they're not capable of being violent. But these are the sorts of things that the WRNA captures. It captures the various needs that we know women have: access to safe housing, trauma and victimization, mental health issues that oftentimes sort of get dismissed in my world as what we call specific responsivity factors, things that need to be addressed for humane reasons that are not actually related to risk. But what we see in our research is, that things like even just symptoms of depression and anxiety are actually criminogenic for women. They are predictive of women's future antisocial behavior. And then we also have to think about the strengths that many women have and help them think about themselves in a way that helps them understand that they, can achieve their goals and do, better in their worlds and for their families and take their rightful places as mothers and wives and partners in their families. And so, the WRNA has kind of revolutionized, I feel like revolutionized, the way we think about risk assessment with justice-involved women. And so it's an instrument that's been implemented in, over 50 different jurisdictions across the country. I've had the privilege of training staff in places as far as Namibia, in Africa, Singapore, the Czech Republic, England is recently started using the instrument as well. So it's intended, myself and my colleagues intended to design this tool from the ground up to think about, what would risk assessment really look like if we started with women in mind. And it's a federally funded tool. It's a non-proprietary tool that was funded originally by the National Institute of Corrections, which is, part of our Bureau of Prison System here in the U.S.
Mm. You talked about how women are so strong and resilient, and I see that so much too in my work, like the power that women have to not only change the trajectory of their lives, but also their children's children, their children, their children's children, and for generations and generations to come. And I think we're starting to see that in the world. I know that I'm starting to see that through different women that I'm getting to know through this project and through this series, children of incarceration or formerly incarcerated parents, women who have come out of the justice system and now are helping others. And you just see like the power that women have. And one thing that struck me that when you were speaking there is when Kim Boguki, when I first met her 2 years ago, I knew nothing, Emily. Like I feel like now I'm no expert, but I feel like I know so much more because I've just talked to so many people and then done so much research on my own. And I've just become really embraced, I feel like, this chapter of my life, or a piece of this One Girl Revolution story. I think that it's such an important topic to be talked about. But Kim Boguki said something to me the first time that I met her, and it's just stuck with me. And you kind of tapped into it there, is how men and women are different in the incarcerated system. But even like in the crimes that they commit, usually for women, there's some other motivating factor. Men will just like go out, they want to rob a bank, they'll rob a bank, or they want to do whatever, they do it. She was like, what's fascinating about women, and I believe that women are fascinating for so many reasons. What's fascinating about women is there's always some other motivating factor. So it's either a boyfriend, a pimp, a spouse, a friend, they're trying to feed their kids, a trauma, right? Like so many women who are incarcerated have a trauma. Can you speak to that a little bit more? Just because I think it's important for people to think about how men and women are different, but even in the crimes that they commit.
Yeah, absolutely right. So the complexity that, that I think all creatures, all of us, sort of have in terms of, we want to people want to try to think about criminal behavior as sort of one motivating factor. And there's a multitude of reasons why people engage in criminal and antisocial behavior. And one of the things that just gets highlighted even more for women, and it doesn't mean that they're blameless for the things that they do. Like people should be held accountable. Doesn't mean they need to be sent to prison. But oftentimes these acts are acts of survival, of simply trying to navigate their worlds in systems that are, historically and currently oppressive. And it's why I have to talk about sort of gender norms and how, things like patriarchy and how they kind of affect people in very individualistic ways. And, when women are trying to navigate their worlds, oftentimes because women are socialized to be more dependent on others in comparison to men, right? It shouldn't be any wonder why we see women oftentimes kind of hook up with people who are not necessarily good for them. I mean, at the end of the day, these women are just trying to find love and security and safety wherever they can find it. And there is actually so much trauma oftentimes in many women's lives who are justice involved that they don't even realize they've been abused. Like that's how normalized it can get for many, women, particularly who find themselves in incarcerated settings. But I think it's important to highlight that, again, this idea that we socialize, part of gender norms is about socializing women to be dependent on others. And the best quote that I can sort of give you on this comes from a very famous moral psychologist, Carol Gilligan. And she writes this in one of her many amazing books, The Birth of Pleasure. So I'm going to quote her because I think it really captures the spirit of this. So masculinity often implies an ability to stand alone and forego relationships, whereas femininity connotes a willingness to compromise oneself for the sake of relationships. But both strategies entail a loss of voice and relationship. And I think, that just sort of speaks to this issue of we are so willing to give up ourselves for our relationships, for our children, for our partners, for our families, that we forget to take care of ourselves. And I know that sounds so cliche, but when you're doing this work and when you, kind of understand the nature of being a woman, it's so true. And it's why we have to help staff, who work with women, help them work through their selves. And oftentimes that is the hardest part for women to really work through, because that's where the pain and the shame and the guilt really lives in terms of their substance abuse and how that has harmed other people, the things that they've done in the past. And but we can't repair other relationships until we're repairing the relationship, with ourselves. And so, those are the complexities, I think, that really go into women's crimes. And again, it doesn't mean women are blameless, but it does mean that the onset of criminal behavior, that it looks different.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that quote that you shared, all women can relate to that, because I think we've all had experiences where maybe you're dating somebody and you start to just become smaller. You make yourself smaller to kind of fit in the crevices of your life or their life or the relationship. And then, shame is such a big thing, and trauma. And one thing that I've really learned from the IF Project, from in the Inside Out program, like a lot of different programs that are working within jails and prisons, and they're doing these storytelling courses. How do you tell your story? And it's so powerful to me. And that's really what this podcast too is all about, is encouraging every person, not just women, but every person to tell their story and speak, because how can you move beyond something that's happened to you or something that you've done if you don't know how to talk about it? And so that's why I think your work is so important, because you're elevating, not just, elevating your research, of course, but you're raising up this army of different people and sharing their experiences.
Thank you. Yeah, it just becomes so important to think about, again, how women walk through this world in a very different way. And certainly how women of color, all women are not sort of homogenous. It's not, monolithic. We also have to think about how, women of color navigate their worlds very differently too. But yeah, the relational piece, usually when I deliver training to correctional staff, sometimes they think, oh, what is this academic, I'm going to come in and really do. I love training correctional staff on these issues. And, they don't know what they don't know. And it's not their fault that they're, also part of and assimilated into systems that are oftentimes cultures of harm, that it's, that's the sort of systems that they're working within. And staff really start to get it when we think about and put a gendered lens on for however long I have them. And to help people understand too, that men are affected by patriarchy, men are affected certainly by these gender norms as well. And that we have a lot of work to do around masculinity as well with incarcerated men. And these are issues that just simply crop up, that if they're not, sort of clearly defined and targeted in treatment and in our systems, they'll continue to sort of oppress and harm.
Emily, I'd love to know, and I know you shared a lot of what you found through your research, but are there a couple of things that throughout the years, as you've been walking this path, that really surprised you, that might really surprise our listeners? They obviously have been following along in this series, but maybe some things that you haven't shared yet that really have opened your eyes.
I mean, I'm amazed at the amount of resilience women have. I just can't emphasize enough that yes, we talk a lot about, of course, the amount of trauma and victimization that many women have experienced, but the amount of resilience and empowerment and strengths when you just start to open your eyes to it, that women have, and that it really just takes kind of a nudge in the right direction with the right, support, that women can be, incredibly resilient. And that to me is one of the most fascinating, amazing things that, having a PhD in criminology, of course, you're always focused on the sort of negative, and, I study risk assessment, right? And so we're always thinking about deficits, and we have to remember the good news story about, resilience in trauma, and what women and any people, anyone can accomplish with the right support and with the right people around them. I think we really have to remember that.
Emily, this podcast is obviously all about stories. So I'm always curious about the women, having different women on to share their own personal experiences. And I believe that women should be able to tell their own stories, but you're here now. And so I'd love to ask you, because you're speaking on panels, you're traveling around, you're doing trainings. I'd love to hear a couple of stories from you, maybe people that you've encountered, maybe formerly incarcerated people or people who work in the justice system, where you've either seen some of the things that you're seeing in your research play out in real time, or maybe people that are doing it right. So maybe someone in the justice system who has found a way to actually elevate women and help women as they come out of the justice system.
I immediately think of a former student of mine. Her name is Leticia Longoria Navarro. She was a master's student of mine back at Portland State University, and she's now running a nonprofit in Portland, just outside of Portland, Oregon. And, she came to me years ago and asked me, I need to develop more gender responsive interventions for our, program behind the wall in Coffee Creek, which is a prison in the state of Oregon. And I essentially gave her a lot of theory, a lot of materials, a lot of principles, a lot of things that, she and her team had to put into action. And I was so incredibly impressed with a year later, after numerous phone calls and sort of, task force meetings, the environment and setting that she created behind the wall in that unit was something that you couldn't even realize how powerful it was for the women who were incarcerated in that unit. Women literally tried to stay in prison longer to get into that program because they knew it was going to tackle the things that they needed to tackle: their trauma, their unhealthy, intimate relationships, themselves, right? Like, word actually spread throughout the institution because of the work Leticia and her team did. And, people ask me all the time, can we have trauma responsive prisons? Does it exist? And I think that's a worthy debate to have. My goal is certainly to not have women incarcerated, is to keep women out, to decarcerate, because again, they just don't pose nearly as much risk of dangerous to the community. But Leticia really, in her team, just put an incredible amount of effort into that unit. And of course, when COVID hit, that unit had to disband and became sort of a COVID quarantine area, and that program is not in existence any longer, which just breaks my heart because of the women who were incarcerated in it. Really were doing incredibly well. So yeah, Leticia is somebody who, and she also, has had experience with the justice system in personal ways herself. So it's incredibly meaningful to me. What a privilege to get to do what I do. I oftentimes, because I'm working with systems and working with agencies, don't oftentimes get to hear the voices of women who, I may or may not be having, an impact with. But anytime I get to sit with, women who are incarcerated or on probation or on parole, it's really important for me to, quite frankly, stop talking and listen. And, another woman who I never learned her name personally, just because of the nature of what we were doing, but I was delivering WRNA training to a community corrections agency. And oftentimes what we do at the end of the training is have staff practice the assessment interview with a justice-involved person. And of course, we don't want to collect identifying information, but it's just simply for the staff to practice. And I'll never forget the look of this one woman who was there, showed up voluntarily to be interviewed. And she just had this look of trauma on her face and look of like a scared little bird. And she doesn't represent every woman in the system, but she represents a big proportion of them. And I just remember thinking, I'll never forget this woman's face. And after the interview, she seemed to sort of light up because we were asking questions that actually mattered to her. And, when we do that, when staff actually, start to ask questions about, people's, women's children in a very careful way, women get some hope that they'll actually, have some programs and interventions specific to women and what they need. So it's almost like the assessment itself is an intervention in some way, which is, again, just incredibly meaningful for me to even be a part of.
If you would like to hear more stories straight from women who have been incarcerated, check out One Girl Revolution's The Girl Inside on YouTube. One Girl Revolution took a film crew behind the walls of the largest single-site jail, Cook County Jail, and interviewed 5 incarcerated women. This short documentary highlights a life-changing academic class and the life and experiences of these 5 women, and what is revealed is the girl inside. You can watch The Girl Inside today on our website at onegirlrevolution.com. And now back to this episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast. I think so often women who are in the justice system, they're seen as just a number or the crime that they committed, right? And even we want to kind of define them by that, like, oh, they did something wrong, they need to be in there. But and I think you could say this a lot about a lot of different things in our world where we just try and define other people by who we think they are or what their zip code is or where they live or the color of their skin or religion or whatever their beliefs are. And I remember, Emily, sitting in that room when we recorded the interviews for The Girl Inside, and we walked in and just started similar thing. We started asking questions. Who are you? Where are you from? When you were a little kid, this was my favorite question. When you were a child, what's your first memory of play? I don't think anyone had ever asked these women that question. And on the flip side, when The Girl Inside came out, I had a lot of people that reached out and they were like, I wanted to know, like, why were they in there? And it's like, that doesn't matter. What matters is their story, who they are as individuals, who they are as people. And when you give women hope, when you remind them of the little girl, the girl inside, that's how it came out, the name came because we were like reminding them, we all need to be reminded of who we were as children before we had trauma in our life, before, we dealt with all the difficulties that the world and life often brings. And so that's just really beautiful, you sharing that.
Oh goodness, I love that so much. What's your first memory of play? I'm going to steal that.
So cute. You should. It was just so, because then they're dreaming, right? They're sitting there, remembering when they were little kids making mud pies. And we all have those memories that's a commonality.
Well, and then, thinking about, just, oppression has of all kinds, has a really good way of suppressing imagination and a sense of wonder. Right. And that's really what you get to bring that out in women. What a gift.
Right. And then they bring it to everyone else too. I think that women have that power where if they feel confident and they feel joyful, it's electric. It sends like electric vibes through everybody else. And women have this power to elevate the others around them. Emily, I know that we're not experts. Well, you're an expert, but we don't control the world. We are only 2 people sitting here. And so I'm not going to ask you, what do you think that we need to do or the world needs to do to solve all the issues? Because I know it's multifaceted. But what are some things that you think that people could be aware of or people could do or that the justice system could do better?
Oh my goodness.
And I know it's going to be a long list, so it's a hard question to ask.
Yeah, there's so many things that we get wrong. Well, I mean, for anybody listening in, right? People think they're just one person. I like to kind of frame it as just dare to care. Dare to care about the issue. And it starts with that, right? Like incarcerated populations in prisons and jails are oftentimes hidden spaces. And if you're able to sort of think about these issues in a way that fosters an ability to really care more about the issue, well then, I would argue it'd be great if people could think about, their world and their community and their role in it. What I like to tell my students oftentimes is, as you learn about these things, you need to consider it a privilege and a responsibility to share what you know. You can't unsee what you have seen. And while it seems like, again, ignorance is bliss and that we can just sort of shut our eyes and keep ourselves blind to the harms that oftentimes go on in our criminal legal system, right? Like so many people would value sitting where you're sitting if you're an educated person and educating yourself. And so many people cannot do that. And so if you have the time and energy it takes to promote these sorts of things, like I would argue you kind of have an obligation to do it. And that's true for myself too, right? I see that as part of my professional identity is to amplify and speak on behalf of people who've not, found their voice, and then sit down and listen when they have found their voice. Yeah.
Emily, what's next for you and for your research and your work? I know you have a lot going on, and the future is really bright in a lot of ways for you, because I think that people's eyes are beginning to be opened. And I know every time you speak publicly or even, speaking to your students, you're opening people's eyes. And so from my perspective, I think that's a really bright future. But what's next for you? What's on the horizon?
Goodness, I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. I mean, I love the work that I do. I think being the director of a research center is incredibly important for promoting policy change and helping stakeholders understand the real nuances of our criminal legal system and juvenile legal systems as well. But I want to do whatever I can to help keep women out. Right. That's the real goal, and to help elevate this risk assessment tool as well to agencies, to help them understand that is a tool that can be used not just by correctional staff but by nonprofits who want to measure the impact of what they're doing with justice involved women. It's in an effort to try to keep women out, right? So I'm also getting into a lot of work on the juvenile side with girls, and helping agencies start to see that the way that we measure risk with girls again is based off of how we measure it with boys, and it's doing a massive disservice for girls who oftentimes again are simply engaging in survival crimes because of serious trauma and victimization in their lives. Mm-hmm. So I live in a world of endless possibilities, and I'm able to live in that world because, again, I have come from places of privilege. And I just want to continue to amplify and elevate, these issues around justice-involved women in whatever ways I can.
There's so much that we can all do, even just little things like you sharing about young girls and like how you're getting into the juvenile side of things. We all have girls in our lives, whether it's nieces or nephews or neighborhood kids. And I think even just empowering those children, like if you can just be a mentor or a good, solid adult in their life, we have so much power. We often think we have to do something really big, like, oh, I have to start an organization, or I don't have the time or money or resources to donate to an organization. But sometimes it's the most simple things, Emily. And I think about that so often, that, pay attention to the people in your community and who are people that might be struggling. If somebody, I know during COVID, so many people had lost their jobs, and that can definitely be a path into incarceration, because they're struggling. And, or if you think somebody might be struggling with addiction, or, somebody is, like, we can just simply be a positive person in their life, and we can help solve some of the issues that our world is facing.
Absolutely right. It doesn't take one grand sort of thing, right? It's just care about the issue, dare to care about the issue, and watch, observe, listen, and think about where you can have your own impact. And you have to know yourself, I think. Know your strengths. What are your superpowers? Right? A very dear friend of mine recently told me, my superpower is I'm a connector. I connect people. I'm really, and so you have to think about what are your strengths and your superpowers as people, who are in positions to help.
Emily, I was going to ask you, what can people do to support your work and support, this issue and talking about this issue? But since we kind of covered that, I want to ask you, why do you think that people should care about this issue?
Well, people, because it's affecting their lives daily, whether they realize it or not. Our mass incarceration system is affecting your children's college tuition, for instance, right? So the more we decide to send people to prison, it's not a sort of budgets in states are not finite or infinite, they're finite. And so every time we decide to send somebody to prison and increase our mass incarceration and carceral systems, we make a decision to not invest in people's education, for example, right? So it could be a number of different issues in terms of why people should really care. But I mean, the research indicates that most people think our correctional systems should actually correct and rehabilitate or habilitate. They believe in these principles. And so people listening in likely sort of feel that way too, no matter where you fall in terms of your political beliefs. But to recognize that we are actually suppressing economic mobility of people, of damaging, decimating whole communities by trying to, incarcerate our way out of a crime problem. And the jury is out. It's a criminological fact that prisons do not reduce future crime in comparison to non-custodial sanctions, meaning probation and community supervision. So they should care, because actually our mass incarceration problem is likely causing more criminal behavior because of the harms that happen behind the wall. So the science is there, and you can't really have conversations anymore about public safety without talking about, treatment and rehabilitation and habilitation of people, and meeting people where they're at and helping them, make better decisions with the scientific principles that are out there to help them, become more productive citizens.
It's all so interconnected. And I am just so grateful for you being on the podcast to share your expertise and to share about your work and your life. And I will be sure to post your TED Talk and some of the other great resources that you shared with me and shared with us today. I'll post them in the show notes so people can easily find them. But Emily, before I let you go, I always end this podcast on one question. So I'd like to ask you, if you could leave women and girls around the world with one message, what would it be?
That's such a powerful question. I think to dream bigger and brighter for yourself. I realize that it's not easy for women and girls, especially, again, economically marginalized girls and women of color, to think in that way oftentimes, because again, oppressive structural systems really do have a way of oppressing imagination of hope and people's sense of wonder. But my wish for women and girls is to live in a world of endless possibilities, because you are far more than you think you are and can achieve far more than you think you can.
Emily, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Thank you for all the great work that you're doing. You are such a revolutionary, a one girl revolution. I'm so grateful for you being on. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the great work that you do.
Kate, I really appreciate your work too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. That's the number one girl REVO. And you can find more information on One Girl Revolution at onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number one girlrevolution.com.